the forcible denial of self-determination. When people are engaged in a struggle for autonomy using peaceful means, and they themselves are then subjected to state terrorism and genocide, which is what we've had in Punjab and has been experienced elsewhere, in those circumstances, there is a right to resist. And this is not just talk. This is something that the international community has historically recognized. I mean, if I can just draw your attention to some key pieces of international law. The 1970 Declaration of the Principles of Friendly Relations between States, which was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly and has now become recognized as a key part of international law. That recognizes the right of struggle for people who are forcibly denied the right to self-determination. Just 4 years later, in 1974, the UN adopted a definition of aggression, which prohibited aggression, and yet made a specific exception for those people who are resisting, struggling against those who are forcibly denying them self-determination. So, I mean, yes, we've had the war on terror, which has clouded judgment, I have to say. But the reality is that the international community has historically recognized that national liberation movements who are operating in circumstances where they have been forcibly denied their rights.
I just want to pick up
they have the right
on what
to
you just
resist.
said. You said it's, the judgment's clouded judgment. What then really differentiates a freedom fighter from a terrorist? I mean, if you had to really get nitty-gritty on it, what would be the defining characteristics of either a freedom fighter or a terrorist?
Well, I think the point is that if there's a national liberation struggle, that has been accepted by the international community as being sufficient criteria to be treated separately. And therefore, i.e., it's been treated as a legitimate struggle. Now, not necessarily advocating violence. International law says that those people are entitled to resist if they are being subjected to violence. So I would put the question a different way. It's not a case of advocating violence to achieve political ends. It's a case of resisting if violence is imposed upon you. And in the case of self-determination and national liberation movements, in that particular case, the international law actually justifies it.
In the partition between India and Pakistan, Pakistan was supposed to be, is a land for a country for Muslims, and that should have been enough to unify Pakistanis. However, in Pakistan, you'll see that we have clashes between Shias and Sunnis, Mahajirs, Punjabis, Sindhis, people that speak Pashto. Do you think that, should we then give each of those fragments, all of these people that are now identifying themselves as Urdu speaking or Punjabi speaking or Sindhi speaking, their own country, and divide that country up even more? Do you think that if you had a Khalistani state, do you think then people within that country would say, well, I'm this caste or I'm that caste, and I think we should have our own little country? Do you think that would then happen?
I think you've got to go back to first principles on this. And the first principles are the consent of the governed, democracy. If you don't have the consent of the governed, then you have no right to govern. Now, if within a particular region you have peoples or nations who do wish to exercise self-determination, it could be greater autonomy, it could be outright independence, whichever form that may take, then you have to respect that. And there is no, in my view, there is no prohibition against allowing people to exercise self-determination.
But where do we draw the line then? Where do we draw the line between, self-determination, where, you have the United States of America and you have people there of all different nationalities, all different backgrounds, and if everybody started then saying, well, we want a country that's just, that we all speak the same language, we're all the same background, we all, it's really, really specific, well, it wouldn't be the United States of America anymore. It would have been fractioned off. So my point is, when is a fight for freedom gone too far? When do we then say, you know what, okay, we are part of this country, we are part of this nation, we should just accept the status quo?
Sanyya, I must come back to this idea of the consent of the governed. If there are a sufficient number of people who have the identity of a people or a nation, and they are keen to exercise to take control of their destiny in a different shape or form, then democracy, I'm afraid, requires you to listen to them. Now, we don't need to go to Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka for this.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the United Kingdom. Scotland is now probably on the road towards independence.
Right, okay.
We have the Scottish National Party, who are open advocates of Scottish independence. They're actually the government now in the Scottish Parliament. Now, they're not treated as terrorists.
That brings me back to the race card, though. Are we just labeling people terrorists if they're brown? And if they're not brown, are they then just freedom fighters? Is it a racial thing?
That's a possibility. I mean, but there are many other factors, as Vijay has mentioned. People have political reasons, people have economic reasons to have affiliations with certain states, and that dictates how they treat individual freedom movements.
We will all agree that money is what makes the world go around, and when it's in our favor economically to support a cause, we will do so.
Yeah.
I want to hear more from both of you. You're watching Broken Silence. We'll be back after this short break. Hi, welcome back to Broken Silence. I'm Sanyya Gardez. When is a freedom fighter not a terrorist? Joining me on the panel is Afzal Shah, studying history from the University of Birmingham, and Ranjit Srai from the Council of Khalistan. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Afzal, what is your take on it? When is a freedom fighter not a terrorist?
I think the way I would answer that question is firstly to define what terrorism is. And I believe terrorism would be anything that would, terrorize a people or a person or a group of people. Terrorism by its nature should be something which, just goes and destroys things. It's not constructive. It kind of destroys and dysfunctions, the lives of people, maybe whether that's through bombs or whether that's, through certain violent protests, or, that kind of disturbs somebody's livelihood in a way which, is irreversible, and that is something that people would fear, would be terrorism. Now, a freedom fight, on the other hand, would be where you've got the idea that the governed should be the people who should make the decision of who they want to be governed by, and if they decide that they don't want to be governed by this particular group or this particular party, then they have the full right to vote for a different party who has a completely different mandate, and if that mandate is secession from a certain bigger state, then then that's what they're fighting for. That's what they wish to be known as an identity. If they can't achieve that through peaceful means, and they have exhausted all forms of peaceful protest and lobbying and trying to get their voices heard, then they need to resort to a means which is a bit more powerful, in the forms of militias, or in the forms of.
So then you are of the opinion that sometimes
physical aggression.
A movement and a fight for autonomy does require a certain amount of violence.
Yes, sometimes it might not, but looking back at history, each and every single time anything like that has happened, because it's taking away power from a bigger nation or a government or a group, that group will try everything within its power in order to prevent that power being taken away from that particular group.
Right, okay. The one thing we haven't said, and I think we need to address, is that in recent days, especially since September 11th, the word terrorism and Muslims are almost synonymous and intertwined. When it's reported there's been a terrorist act, it's followed by Muslim, or preceded by it. Do you think that that stereotype is justified?
Well, the short answer is no. Of course, that stereotype isn't justified. As far as the 9/11 attacks are concerned, which were on the United States of America, it still hasn't been proven whether they were done by, Al-Qaeda or any other group associated to Muslims. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those attacks that took place were right attacks. In my own opinion, I believe they were wrong attacks.
Of Bin Laden owning up to it and saying, kind of fessing up to the fact that